national governments' laws and seeing how things work. But really, it is a fact of independent rules that are identifiable and that govern interstate relations. When I speak about international law, I locate international water law under the umbrella of the United Nations Charter, which really, at its heart, is to promote regional peace and security. I think this is a critical issue for this region, and so I decided when I was invited by Xiamen Law School to come here and have a look from the inside at what is happening in China. And China, as perhaps many of you know, is upstream on about 40 major international water courses. And so as this discourse and this audience is about Hong Kong and the mainland, you saw from Feng's presentation that dealing with domestic issues in China really comes, it's quite necessary, but we must look at this in the context of where China sits and some of the issues. So the problems we have in China with our transboundary water resources interstate within China, you take those and you can only magnify the magnitude of potential problems at a transboundary level. So here is the UN. How many people have ever read the United Nations Charter? How many people have the UN Charter with them today? All good international lawyers and all good water people in China carry the UN Charter with them. And if you look at Article 1, what is the UN Charter about? Really, it is to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character, and in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights, and I think this one is pretty important, fundamental freedoms of all. And I think if we are going to study how we promote regional peace and security, indeed even within this region, talking about the mainland and Hong Kong, I would like to interrogate what fundamental freedoms for all means in the context of transboundary water resources management. And so we have a couple of, we have a series of UN declarations on what the duty to cooperate might mean. I'll let you have a read there. You know, the high points: maintain international peace and security, international cooperation, irrespective of the differences in their political, economic, and social systems and in the various spheres of international relations. So I'd invite you to reflect on that. And the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, when he was looking to reform the United Nations, issued this really good report that I use a great deal in my work. And it's entitled In Larger Freedom. And I'm wondering whether that couldn't be something we could use on the water problem here. In a larger freedom, in a world of interconnected threats and challenges, it is in each country's self-interest, and self-interest is important actually, that resonates, that's sovereignty with the capital S, that all of them are addressed effectively. Hence, the cause of a larger freedom can only be advanced by broad, deep, and sustained global cooperation among states. Such cooperation is possible if every country's policies take into account not only the needs of its own citizens, but also the needs of others. And so do we find a theme here for addressing the upstream and downstream challenges in the mainland and Hong Kong? This kind of cooperation not only advances everyone's interest, but also recognizes our common humanity. And I think that is borne out clearly in all of the transboundary work that we do. So what could international water law bring to the Hong Kong mainland question? I wanted to think about this. Did anybody know that there was this UN resolution declaring 2013 the Year of Water Cooperation? How many people knew that? 3. Okay. Well, the UN declaration actually sets a pragmatic, aspirational target for national governments to cooperate, not only at the international level, but really at the national level, to set water development plans. And I believe China has taken steps on that. So we have, the United Nations has recognized the importance of water. And last year there was a flurry, so many international meetings, many of which, you know, we don't want to go to. But I think it signals that the international community has woken up and accepted that water is a huge and important issue. Now, if we locate international law as an integrating vehicle for transboundary water relations, this is what I've come up with. I really think that international law and international water law sets a meta framework for international relations, because the law of nations, ascribed and contained in the UN Charter, lets us know how states should interact. But more than that, and especially in the field of international water law, it sets a platform for integration, and I will show you on the next slide what that means. And most people think that international law is just about this, the treaties, the substantive rules, but in fact, it cuts across each of these three areas, and it's something that is relevant to this discourse. So if we look at international water law, because it is a separate system, it has to deal with scale issues, so that treaties, we don't just live at this level, we actually go from the human, user level, national, regional. So the scale issues in transboundary international water law could actually help the scale issues in China's transboundary water law, indeed even in the Hong Kong situation. International water law also has to cope with disciplinary interface, and so we are working and have to. Real water lawyers don't just hang out with the lawyers. And that's why I'm delighted to be here. We have to take into account political features, economic issues, societal and environmental. And so this integration, I believe, is integral to how we do international water law. So are there any ways that law, international law, can contribute? Well, this is really important because, as Guy said, my other colleague lawyer, the international framework really is about definitions and identifying the who, the what, the water, the when, the how, and probably the why. And how do we do this? This is really the takeaway message, the legal analytical framework for evaluating whether a transboundary water regime is robust or not. We look at issues of scope, legal reach, what are the uses, what are the users, and how are they protected and identified. Substantive rules and international law, the overarching rule is that each nation state is entitled to an equitable and reasonable use. Many people have challenged this overarching rule as being far too general. In fact, I believe if you think about it and analyze it as we have done in Dundee and Salmon, it is the ideal rule for transboundary water resources. And then we move into where I think we should spend most of our time in a transboundary context on the procedural rules, the institutional mechanisms, and the dispute settlement. And so this is an accessible mechanism for analyzing any treaty or transboundary water regime. This is the course that I have taught around the world and advised around the world. I won't take you into the details. It's just to illustrate that law, like science, has an analytical framework that can be used in a very technical way. The UN Watercourses Convention, which China voted against in 1997, contains two very important provisions on the duty to cooperate, which I believe China embraces fully from my examination of all of the treaties that China has signed. And basically Article 8 says watercourse states shall, but look what follows, and I think this is important in China's transit, on the basis of sovereign equality, territorial integrity, mutual benefit, and good faith, in order to attain optimal utilization and adequate protection of the international watercourse. I think everything is there for what we should be doing within China and out with China. In the UN Watercourses Convention, which China has not ratified, but which now has entered into force, and so actually is a piece of law that is a global instrument, I think the factors listed in Article 6 provide you with a means, especially appealing to the scientists and the policymakers in the room, for how we determine what is an equitable and reasonable utilization. What does it say? Basically it says, all relevant factors on this river at this time should be considered together with an evaluation at this time considered together and a conclusion reached on the basis of the whole. This makes the transboundary water law that applies to any water course a living and moving and flexible instrument that actually can take on board issues such as demographics, population, alternative uses, climate change, and so and so. And so despite popular misperception that international water law or water law is actually static and inflexible and irrelevant, I would challenge you on all of those. The UN Watercourses Convention provides this due diligence duty, and I'm wondering how that would translate into a national context, because it doesn't say no harm. What it says is take all appropriate measures to prevent the causing of significant harm, which is a different measure. And I'm wondering, when Guy was talking about bringing all of the stakeholders around the table, would it not be less invasive or threatening to upstream states if you say that the duty is due diligence to do the best that you can, given the circumstances, rather than saying don't pollute, absolutely? This is a difference. And so finally, I'm just going to wrap up with how I think we should be looking. I hope, Scott, for your book, that I would examine how international water law principles, these key principles, might influence transboundary within China and address the Hong Kong. So here are the headline events. So we've heard from Feng about a world without water. I think that is surely China, and I think if Hong Kong thinks that it's anything other than that, then they should wake up and smell the coffee. There will not be any coffee. There won't be any money for coffee beans or any water for the coffee. So I believe that if we look at the principles of equitable and reasonable on the substantive rules, these three areas will provide us with guidance on how national law might move in I think, a helpful way, focusing on the principle of equitable and reasonable use in a domestic context, the duty, the due diligence duty not to cause significant harm in a domestic context, and then this interest, informed interest on how we do satisfy and meet ecosystem protection requirements. If we look at the procedural components, which often is missed out when people look at rules of international law or rules of water law, I believe more focus should be on governance and institutional mechanisms and how they operate, and certainly I've looked at all of the river basin organizations in China. What you have to do for planned measures when some activity is undertaken upstream, what are the requirements for notification and exchange of information? That could be very important, I think, in a domestic context and could be developed further. And then, very interestingly enough, on dispute prevention and settlement, I was struck to hear from Sue, Miss Sue, where she said we get back to negotiation, or Guy said we get back to negotiation. This is deeply embedded in the Chinese approach to dispute settlement. And in international law, Chinese subscribes to negotiation, consultation, and non-intervention. That was really China's stance in international law. In the domestic context, then, where we're looking for more enforcement, I'm wondering if we're pushing against a door that is not ready to be opened up. And should we not be thinking about alternative mechanisms for preventing disputes, such as enhanced institutional mechanisms and planned measures, the exchange of information and notice requirements, and think about mechanisms such as conciliation, mediation, third-party engagement, or some high-level political engagement that might solve disputes in a way, instead of just saying we need to have better dispute settlement mechanisms. I think we have to look. And so, current international water challenges on the international scale. I've looked at all of the treaties on China's 40 major transboundary watercourses, and basically we have a lot of treaties in the north, nothing in the south. Most of the development is coming up in the south and the southwest, and what are we going to do about that? Huge challenges on the horizon. Kazakhstan and China, Sino-Kazakh relationships seem to be moving in a positive way. In September, they signed a new MOU saying that we will look at allocation issues. Relations with Russia have only improved, strengthened bilateral relations. So I'm not so concerned about the north, but I'm quite concerned about the southwest. So I will be looking at that and trying to develop what it means in international law to have downstream benefits recognized and dealt with, or as many Chinese call it, eco-compensation. I think that is a new issue. And then I'm also just concerned about the upstream dilemma. What is the upstream dilemma? What's the upstream? You have a country, you're the Minister of Water Resources, your country happens to be China, and you just happen to be upstream. So what should you do? How do you decide? How do you deal with domestic, and yet you know, China's foreign policy is clearly to be the good neighbor. And it's not just rhetoric. If you examine all of the foreign policy statements under President Xi and Premier Li, you will see that they have been actively engaging with neighbors in bilateral relations, in regional organizations such as ASEAN, Shanghai Cooperation Agreement. So China wants to take into account and be seen as the good neighbor. But it has a problem because it's a vast population with many water challenges. So I would like to look at what the upstream dilemma means in practice. And that's some of the work we're doing in Xiamen at the China International Water Law Program, where we have a team of lawyers, the first China International Water Law Program in China, looking at domestic issues and international issues. We just had our first water law symposium, which had to be approved at all sorts of levels, but was approved and was a huge success. We had 60 people there looking at international water law issues. And I hope to bring on some more students. So I hope, Scott, we can, and Hong Kong, we could talk about PhD programs and so, because the future really is, and here's where you can come and visit me in one of the most beautiful campuses in China. So thank you all very much. I hope that I've said one or two things that are helpful, and it's a delight to be here. Thank you again.